Hi, I'm Maddie, and this is Let's Get Trashy. So, I have someone to introduce to you. This is Bonesies. He's the physical representation of taking the skeletons out of the closet. I thought the perfect time to introduce him would be the episode about generational trauma, taking the skeletons literally out of the closet so that we can heal them. So, he's here to help us, take our skeletons out of the closet. I will definitely be making several skeleton puns throughout every episode. I have no apologies for it. I think you guys also probably noticed that in the last episode I didn't have the intro song like I normally do, not even on the audio version, and that's just because I wanted to come up with a new intro for the video version, and I just kind of forgot to put the intro song on the audio only version. So hopefully the new intro will be up. I'm going to be honest with you guys, sometimes life is busy and I forget to do things that I want to do for this podcast and I want to do for you guys. So hopefully it's up. If it's not, it'll definitely be up next week because I will definitely have time to do it. Also, I don't know if you guys notice the way that I notice, but this is very clearly off-centered, and it's because this whole setup was set up before I had thought of Bonesies here. And this tray, like, I don't know, it's hung up by a hook, so it's not going anywhere. So like I couldn't like adjust it, so we just had to squeeze in really tight and make room. So I'm sorry if it like bothers you that it's off-centered. Hopefully I can get it centered. If not, just listen to the audio version. But if you follow me on Instagram, you know that this week we're going to be talking about generational trauma. And it's weird, when I decided to do this episode, I purely based it off of memories that I had, like little family events where I remember like severely traumatic stories being told. And then on Monday of this week, a memory on my actual like Facebook, because I don't know if you guys like ever check yours, but I check mine, and it's talked about, or it was an uncle that had brought up that I needed to work on my relationship with my dad, or he asked if I had worked on my relationship with my dad. And it was crazy because it was like, why did I need to work on the relationship when I wasn't the parent? And I was also 13. Like, I was clearly a child. I mean, at 13, I'm sure I thought I knew it all and that I had it all together and that, I was old enough to handle any situation. But now as an adult, I see that that's complete bullshit, and I didn't have it all together, and I didn't know it all, and that I shouldn't have been the one to be repairing this relationship. I want to bring up the fact that generational trauma is not just like the outer layer. It's not just like your parents had a shitty childhood, their parents had a shitty childhood, so it all got brought down to you, like poorly raised parents, poorly raised grandparents. It's DNA leveled. It goes all the way down into our genetics. And it talks about this in the book It Didn't Start With You, and I'll actually have that linked in the description below. That way you guys can read it. I'm not gonna lie to you guys. I got, did you hear that snap crackle pop? I got frustrated with this book only for the fact that it talked so significantly about one side of it, and I guess if you're going to talk about genetics, it's probably best to talk about the person that creates the most genetics in you and creates you in general is your mother. But I have a lot of trauma with my father, so I don't know, I didn't feel like they talked about that enough. But I will link it in the description below. In the book, it discusses how it is in your DNA and how it is brought through genetics. And I think one or two great examples of this is when your grandmother is pregnant with your mother and your mother is being formed, your genes are already being formed too. Whether you're a female or a male, your genes are already being created in your mother, and what will carry on to you is being created at the same time that your mother's being created, which is fucking wild. And like, I guess I always do that because women are born with their eggs, but still very weird to think about. And And in this example, the grandmother loses her husband, right? So now she's a widow and she's having to grieve the loss of her husband. She's having to take on new responsibilities. It's a very stressful time because now she's probably having to learn how to provide for herself and you now that she's lost her husband. And this can create, grief. This can create depression. But then this depression would actually carry on into your mother, so you might be more prone to be depressed. You might be more prone to have anxiety, to not handle like death well because of this on a genetic level. Another like great example of this, and I think this can kind of go sadly into our world today, but if you're a refugee and you're running away from your home that's in a war zone, and you've had to experience bombs, and you've had to experience, lack of food, and you haven't been able to, maybe you've been hiding like in a closet so that way you're safe, so you're in a small space, but now you're fleeing, so your adrenaline's high, but all the while, you're pregnant with a child, and that child is, or you're pregnant with a female child, and that female child is also creating her cells. It would create PTSD symptoms. So like with PTSD, most of us know that like a war veteran that comes home would be more likely to be scared of like loud noises. So thunderstorms and fireworks might be triggering. Obviously there's other triggers. PTSD is very, person based. So what you went through would be what your PTSD looks like. But in this scenario for the mother, the PTSD for the children would probably look like thunderstorms scaring them, an unnatural fear of like being trapped, and that's because their mother had to stay, or their mother or grandmother had to stay in a small space. And so it's like these PTSD symptoms, sorry Bonesy, I'm gonna scoot you over here, carried down to you, and not just stay in your mother or your grandmother. It's weird. It's these fears that you almost wouldn't be able to explain to someone being passed down to you. I think that was pretty cool to read, because now I look at people and like the way they act, or like the mental illnesses they have, and I'm like, oh, I wonder, like, was your mother your mother or your grandmother in a severely stressful situation? Like, what happened? Was it just trauma? Like, I don't know. It gives me more compassion after reading this book to see why people are the way that they are. And I think that's the biggest thing we need to remember is like everybody has a story, everybody has trauma, everybody's gone through something that makes them the way that they are. So to have more compassion to that is probably the best way to go about loving everyone. And then you go on to the fun trauma, where it really is like, your dad was raised shitty, his parents were raised shitty, so they treat you shitty. Or it's just like those generational things where it's like, in the old times they used to literally not let children in the living room. So now you have a parent that's like, I don't like kids, but it's like, why the fuck did you have kids? Or you have a grandmother or a mother that had, 13 children, so now her children don't want children, but in the time period they have to then have children, and then they're resentful because they didn't want kids because maybe they were the oldest of 13, so now they're taking care of kids again when they've taken care of kids their whole life, so now they're resentful towards you, so they're not a nurturing mother. So then you grow up without a nurturing mother, you think this is the norm, so now you're not nurturing to your children. And then, whether their children are like, I didn't like how I was raised, so I'm going to be different, so I'm going to be more nurturing, I'm going to be there for my kids. Or the other side of it, their grandfather and their father were all war veterans, so they're very like army, military based, they give you like, and I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but endurance-y punishments. So, you might be like getting push-ups or something like that. I know for my family, my grandfather was in the military, very military-based mindset. So when his children would get in trouble, it was like if one person did something, they would all get in trouble, and then they would all have to line up in the garage and be paddled, and if they didn't pick the right paddle, they would get in more trouble because a paddle with holes causes more pain than a paddle without holes. So if they picked the wrong paddle, they would be in more trouble. And what's crazy is they would tell me this story. Like, obviously I had to hear the story from someone, and they would all be laughing about it. And it's like, I don't know, I always listen to these stories of like, that was abuse. Like, you guys were abused, and that's not right. Also, staying within this family, you know, I had a grandmother who was a military wife, so she was taking care of everything. And she wasn't just a military wife when there wasn't conflict, she was a military wife like during the severe wartime. So she was home, you know, with 6 children by herself. Her husband was not very loving, and when he was home, it was very much like probably walking on eggshells, you know, very scared to get in an argument. He just wasn't a loving, nurturing person. So, you know, I think that there was some domestic violence within that relationship, and I think their children saw it. Sadly, for me, my father was the oldest of this, so he took on probably a lot of the responsibility of helping his mother. And so he, as an adult, probably didn't want that much responsibility, so that's the reason he chose the lifestyle that he did. I think a lot of the trauma, too, is the reason that he chose to be a drug addict, which caused my trauma later down the line. Well, not even later down the line, but down the line. And I just, generational trauma, or this fun portion of generational trauma is, I say fun because, I mean, it's easier to be funny about it than to truly, like, get into how sad and deep it is. But it affects you so negatively. So if you have a father that's abusive, and you have a father that's absent, and you have one that is not nurturing, you as a man is probably going to learn those traits. And if you decide to change it, good fucking job, you are changing the cycle. Sadly, that's not the case in my family. He was not nurturing. He was very absent-minded. He was a drug addict. He chose his life over nurturing his children. And I think that goes all the way back to how his parents were raised. And sadly, I don't know much about how they were raised, but I can probably tell you that there wasn't a lot of love in the home from my grandfather. On the other side of it, I kind of spoke about how, you know, the oldest of 13 kids, for my grandmother, or for the mother side, less nurturing. And that actually is relative to my grandmother's story and her mother and things like that. But I think also, you know, if you grow up in a family and you do hear those stories where you're like, dude, that was very clearly abuse, I think that's like the first step of understanding that it's not right and that there needs to be a change. And I think that we do have to make that change and make sure that the cycle doesn't continue. Like I said on my story on Instagram, if you didn't see it, I basically said, you know, you need to treat children like children and not hold them responsible for the adults' actions. And I think that that's one of the first steps, is like, and all of it is like, you as an adult, you need to heal your stuff. So that way when your child does something that's triggering, you're not holding them responsible for your trigger. For me, it's hard to talk about generational trauma because I only know my story. So I think of that, I'll stick with talking about my story. And in my story, my family, they didn't grow up nurtured. They didn't grow up with a lot of love in their home. Yeah, maybe the kids had a lot of fun together. You know, they're, in particular, my dad's side, there were 6 of them, so they probably all got to play together. You know, they grew up in a house that had a pool, in a military community, so they probably had friends. They also probably moved around a lot because it was military, and with military, you move probably every 3 to 4 years. So not a lot of stability, which now as I'm saying that, I realize why there was no stability in my home, because you never saw like long-term stability. Clearly words are hard today. And I think when you look at that and you look at your family's trauma, you can kind of understand why they were the way that they were. So in this instance, like I said, my father didn't have a lot of stability, which clearly I just learned, didn't have a lot of stability. He was the oldest, so he's probably taking on a lot of responsibility. And if he wasn't, then I really don't understand why he was the way that he was. And, you know, he probably got a lot of the punishments for the younger ones because he was the oldest. He was supposed to be guiding them. He was supposed to be doing these things. And as an adult, this like turned into and manifested into, you know, a lack of responsibility. He was tired of being the responsible one, so he no longer wanted to be the responsible one. So, you know, that's probably why the instability happened, where he couldn't keep a job, where he couldn't keep a house, where he couldn't keep the lights on, he couldn't keep the water running, he couldn't keep food in the house. And then I think on top of all of that, like I said, his parents were abusive. His mother was in a domestic violent relationship, so that's probably why he treated women so fucking poorly. I think also seeing all that abuse is probably a lot of the reason that he did drugs. Because once you start so I think that's a lot of the reason he started doing drugs, is because he didn't really know how to heal from the things that he saw, so he used drugs. And then once you start using drugs, it's this vicious cycle of making poor choices on them. And I say this out of experience, and I don't say this out of like maliciousness or like judgment. I say this purely out of experience and with my own problems of drug abuse, that, you know, once you start this cycle of using drugs, you make poor decisions, you steal money from people, you choose drugs over your family, you might put your children in a poor situation, and so then you continue to use drugs so you're not having to face these things. And I think that's just the cycle that he got stuck in. And I'm not saying all of this to make an excuse, and I'm not saying all of this so you're like, wow, she had a shitty fucking life. I'm saying this as like, just look at the generational trauma and how it manifested in their life. Listen, because I'm sure that you guys have heard stories where it's like, oh shit, that was fucked up. And those little stories will explain so much. And that's, honestly, I'm not going to say that I understood that until truly recently, within the last 3 months, where I was like, oh, that makes sense. Oh, I get that now. Oh, I understand why you were the way that you were. Does that take away and invalidate your feelings and invalidate your trauma? No, but for me personally, having that compassion and hearing their stories made it easier for them to forgive myself. And not forgive myself, made it easier for me to forgive them and myself. So I didn't need to go have this conversation with my dad, because like I said in the first episode, do not put yourself in a toxic situation. So if that conversation is not going to be good and it's not going to be beneficial for you, don't have it, but forgive them within yourself. And having that compassion and seeing how that generational trauma played out into their lives was very helpful for my forgiveness, for me forgiving them, for my healing journey. But I'm not going to reach out to him because I know who he is and I know how he is, and it's not going to be a beneficial conversation. And the same goes for my mom's side too. I'm just giving you guys my generational trauma examples. That way you guys can kind of listen to your stories of your family and be like, oh, okay, now I see how this kind of adds up. On top of all of it, clearly read that book that I'm putting in the bottom. It Didn't Start With You. It's a great place to start when you're looking at generational trauma. But on my mom's side, like I said, you know, my grandmother's mother was one of 13 or 11. I'm not really sure. And I know that's like kind of a gap, but she was one of a lot. She was the oldest of a lot. And so she would have to help take care of all these younger ones. And she was also born in a time where a woman, I'm not going to say she was forced, but it was more likely for her to be better off in life if she got married, and every woman knew that, sadly. Thankfully, we're not in a time like that anymore. But so she raised all these 13 children. She was then pretty much told she needs to go get married and have children of her own. And I think that because she was the oldest and she had to raise all these children for her whole freaking life, that when she had her own children, she wasn't nurturing. And you can see how she wasn't nurturing, and you can hear the stories of how this mother wasn't nurturing, and how my grandmother had to do a lot of things by herself and kind of be alone a lot because her family, her dad was always working, her mom wasn't a nurturing, loving, open-armed kind of mother. And so it very much manifested into my grandmother being more nurturing than her mother, but still not still not great. I'm just gonna say it like that. Still, very much picking favorite children, leaving children out, saying things that are harmful to her children, and just overall not saying that she wasn't a great mother. She was, but saying things that did hurt her children and hindered their experience as children. And you see that from her mother down to her, and then I can kind of see it in my mother, where it was kind of like not having a great example of how to do things, so she was trying to learn to do it herself, but she was still trying to like be herself, and it was just like a very much confusing time of like, how do I show nurture but still heal myself from things? And so you kind of see how like this lack of nurturing was brought all the way down to me. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know my siblings' stories. I know my story and how, I was kind of left in situations because there were times when my mother chose herself. That being said, she did leave a domestic violence relationship, so I kind of understand it. Does that understanding take away from my valid feelings? No. But like I said, knowing this helps me have compassion, helps me forgive. But I see how this line brought down to me, and how my father's line brought down to me and gave me a whole story of fuck. So, I mean, with this story of fuck, like, I see how both cycles kind of have to end with me. And I think that if you look at both of your sides and how just their stories affected you and what they went through, you can have more compassion. And maybe, hopefully, it does help you on your healing journey. Because it helped me on mine in the sense that I got it. Like, I understood why they were the way that they were. Again, like I've said several times, knowing the way that they are is not to invalidate your feelings. Is not to take away from you. Generational trauma is tricky because, like I said, it is in your cells, it's DNA, it's genetics, so you do have to heal that layer. And yes, you can heal your DNA. It takes time, it takes therapy, it takes, healing your inner child. It takes a lot of effort. But then you also have to heal your mind in generational trauma, where it's like, I went through all of this abuse and I didn't deserve this abuse, or I went through all this neglect and I didn't deserve this neglect, or just in general, I went through all this trauma and I didn't deserve this trauma. So I have to focus and heal on this trauma. And doing so, you do have to set aside this stuff and focus on you. But you do also have to take it into consideration when you're forgiving them. And maybe you don't. Maybe, hearing all of this doesn't make it easier for you, but it did make it easier for me. And I think that that's what I want you guys to get from it, is like the compassion to forgive them. Not the compassion to reach out and be like, oh, I understand why you're a drug addict, and I understand why you were abusive, and I understand why you were the way that you are. But take it in for yourself in the sense that you can forgive them and you can show them compassion inside of yourself. Like I said, if the conversation's going to be toxic, don't reach out. Don't reach out. Don't have that conversation. Do what is best for you, because at the end of the day, you kind of have to take care of yourself. But I hope that with this episode, you did see that generational trauma goes all the way down the line. It brings everything kind of into full circle fruition of like, oh, this makes sense. This is why it is the way that it is. This is why you act the way that you do. But that does not mean that it was okay for you to treat me the way that you did. It does not mean that you were allowed to be abusive and, not feed me because you had to be so responsible your whole life. So it was okay that you gave me an unstable one. You know what I mean? Generational trauma is just kind of a diagram of why, not a reason for it to be okay. I think the best way to end this episode is to say that the cycle ends with us, that we have to do better for ourselves and for our children and for future generations. That generational trauma doesn't have to keep going. You don't have to keep being the way that they were, I guess is the best way to say that, and that you can do better, but you have to heal yourself. You have to forgive them, because being angry at a situation and being angry at someone is truly like drinking the poison. and expecting them to be hurt. And I know I said that on the last episode, but that's the best way to say it, is like, if you don't heal yourself, you're continuing to drink that poison, expecting them to get sick, expecting them to feel the hurt. And the only person that's feeling that hurt is you. So you gotta let it go. You gotta feel it and validate it and know that you're not there anymore. Generational trauma is a fucking bitch, bro. And it's not easy to heal it. Like, there are so many things that I didn't talk about that I still see in my line, that I still have to work on, that I still have to end, and that the cycle has to stop with me, because my kids will not have to go through the things that I went through. And I hope you guys have this same scenario, that like, you're not going to do the same for your children. If you don't want to have children, you're going to do better for those that you come in contact with. Like, the cycle truly ends with us. And I think the best way to do that is to heal yourself. This one was choppy. Generational trauma is so hard to navigate, especially right now when I'm posting this one right before Easter, and I'm going to go have to spend time with my family, and I know that they're going to be like, bro, why'd you bring this up? And truly, it's not my responsibility to feel their feelings. It's my responsibility to heal myself. So I'm still learning that. So I'm still like trying to navigate that nicely, when I really shouldn't have to be worried about that. I want to thank you guys all for listening to episode 2. Remember, the cycle ends with us. We're going to end this like we did the last one, with a few gratitudes, a few things we're grateful for. Remember, they don't have to be big. They don't have to be huge. You don't have to be grateful for the sun, the moon, the stars. You don't have to be grateful that there's oxygen on Earth. You know, just be grateful for the small things. I'm grateful that Bumsy finally made it in. I ordered him twice. I got refunded twice. And then I finally ordered him, and then he got lost, and then he came. So now he's here, and he's in our episodes, and he'll be here for a while. I'm grateful that I was able to kind of navigate this, even though we're super crowded. And I'm grateful for my family. I'm grateful that I have a husband that always supports me. I'm grateful that I have children that argue. And I know that sounds so funny, but they're at an age now, they're 4 and 2, where they're learning how to argue. And it's so funny, because it's like, it's a marker. Share it, you know? Like just get along. But I am grateful for the life that I live. And I hope that you guys are grateful for the life that you live. And I'm so proud of you guys for coming here and trying to heal yourself and working on yourself. The last episode was in healing your inner child. I didn't link the books I found on Amazon below that episode, so I'll do it on this episode. You can, like I said, you can also look on Reddit, Healing Your Inner Child. Look on Amazon, Healing Your Inner Child books. Those 4 questions were just questions that helped me. I hope they helped you, and I hope that you guys find questions that are more beneficial for yourself. As I leave this episode, remember, the cycle ends with you, and I love you guys. Bye!